Well, thanks so much. I hope you've got some energy left in the tank at the end of the day. So I'll try to do my best and keep things light and short, hopefully. So far we've been discussing phenomenal concepts quite a bit already today, and their relation to various transparency principles and their semantic properties, for instance. And I guess I want to push us towards another question, namely, what can we do with phenomenal concepts? Because in my view, phenomenal concepts are not just those fancy pieces of philosophical theorizing that philosophers have designed to, say, fight over the status, the metaphysical status of consciousness or conscious experience. So what can we do with phenomenal concepts? In my view, sorry, just struggling with these. So the answer, or one answer, is do phenomenological reflection. It's part of my title. And phenomenological reflection, in my view, is, well, it's at least part a matter of forming phenomenal concepts by attending to the phenomenal character of our current experience. But phenomenological reflection is also reflection in terms of phenomenal concepts and reflection about the relations that there are between different phenomenal concepts and the relation between what those concepts are concepts of. And in my view, these relations have to do with what I call here phenomenal structure. So this is something I've been started to work on very recently, and some of those ideas I will present. They build on work we've been doing with Martina Nida-Rümelin for a paper that's going to come out very soon on phenomenal concept and imagination. But I'm going to start here by showing you some photos of men from the 19th century German-speaking world. I mean, the first one is probably lesser known. Probably got the second. The second is Franz Brentano. And the first is called Hermann von Helmholtz. He's the author of a book entitled On the Sensations of Tone as a Physiological Basis for the Theory of Music. And so here is something that Brentano had to say on Helmholtz and on his theory. Brentano writes, in his analysis of sound, Helmholtz has explained which partial phenomena compose the phenomenon of a tone, i.e. strength, pitch, and timbre. He has done nothing else than clarifying the concept of tone with respect to a number of inner characteristics, without which it would not be the same concept anymore. But who would dare to make the paradoxical assertion that in doing so, he has not increased our knowledge? So where do I want to go with that? Well, I want to explore whether some version of dual carving can maybe be motivated on that basis. I see some puzzled looks, so you'll see if this is what you expect or not. So here's the definition of dual carving that Philip gives in his 2017 book. He says dual carving is the thesis that there are multiple ways of grasping the essence of some properties or kinds. More precisely, for at least one property, kind K, there are at least two conceptually distinct, transparent concepts of K. And this is significant for this debate about the phenomenal concept strategy, because Philip writes, if dual carving is possible, it could be that thinking of pain under a phenomenal concept on the one hand, and thinking about pain under a pure physical concept on the other are just two equally good, but conceptually distinct ways of grasping the essence of pain. Right, so dual carving has an earlier formulation in this 2011 paper by Philippe, where he was saying for some property F, there are two conceptually distinct ways of knowing what it is for F to be instantiated. And here is something that Martina-Linda Rümelin has in her paper, Grasping Phenomenal Properties. She calls this the principle of cognitive transparency, which in effect is really the negation of dual carving. She writes, a person who grasps one and the same property via different concepts can in principle find out, without further empirical investigation, that the two concepts are necessarily coextensive. Right, so as you've guessed, this presupposes transparent concepts, so concepts that allow you to grasp the essence, or to grasp a property, or to know what it is for a property to be instantiated. And the question I want to ask is the following. Right. Can there be multiple ways of grasping the essence of some properties, where those multiple ways are multiple phenomenal ways? I will suggest that in an important sense, there can be multiple phenomenal ways of grasping the essence of a phenomenal property. And that by exploring whether in such a case the two phenomenal concepts are really distinct, as the definition of dual carving requires, we can learn something about phenomenal reflection as well. Right. Okay. So back to Brentano and his quote. So here's something that Gianfranco Soldati has written in a book manuscript on Brentano that he's co-authoring with Arnaud de Valk. So his analysis of what Brentano is doing here is the following. He says, as Brentano puts it, Helmholtz has explained which partial phenomena compose the phenomenon of a tone. The statement a tone is composed of strength, pitch, and timbre is not establishing a relation between things that appear in different ways, but a relation between an appearance and its constituent parts. Right. So Brentano thinks that here we have an analysis of the experience of hearing a tone, right? When we have this analysis that Helmholtz puts forward in terms of those three components. Okay. So here's my initial distinction between two kinds of phenomenal concepts I want to put on the table. First one I call acquaintance phenomenal concept. So you can form an acquaintance phenomenal concept of hearing a given tone, and you typically do so when you form it on the basis of experiencing what it is like to hear that tone. And here's this other concept that I call a structural phenomenal concept. And you form a structural phenomenal concept of hearing a tone when you form it in terms of the particular strength and pitch and timbre of the tone. So yeah, perhaps you suspect that when one uses structure, one is not really saying much because in a sense anything is structured. So I'm going to clarify the sense in which I want to use the term in a moment. But here I really want to use it to name that contrast between those two types of concepts. As you can see, this characterization is really a characterization in terms of their conditions of acquisition. I'm going to give you a theoretical characterization that goes beyond that in a minute. Here's another example. Seeing pure blue. So, again, consider Paul. So Paul, as you are, he's seeing an expanse colored in pure blue. Here you have different shades with more or less black in it. And he forms an acquaintance phenomenal concept of seeing pure blue on the basis of experiencing what it is like to see pure blue. Normal case, usual case of phenomenal concept that is discussed in the literature. Now consider Paola. Paola has never seen the color pure blue, but she has acquired the phenomenal concept of seeing a unique hue as opposed to seeing a binary hue. And she also has the phenomenal concept of seeing reddish blue and of seeing greenish blue. And on that basis, she forms a structural phenomenal concept of seeing pure blue. So she uses, what Paola does is that she uses the relevant phenomenal concept that she already possesses. And she uses also the relations and her understanding of the relations that there are between what those concepts are concepts of. And she forms a phenomenal concept of seeing pure blue that I call a structural phenomenal concept. So binary hues are hues that are phenomenally composed in that understanding. So phenomenally they appear to be composed of different hues. That's the conception of binary hue I'm using here. Unique hues are not phenomenally composed, and thus they do not have a trace of other hues. Okay, so here are two claims I want to make at this stage. So claim one, if there are phenomenal concepts, if there are transparent phenomenal concepts, sorry, then at least some structural phenomenal concepts are transparent phenomenal concepts. And claim two, if at least some structural phenomenal concepts are transparent, then there can be multiple phenomenal ways of grasping the essence of some properties. So I'm going to largely be presupposing, for the sake of this argument, that there are transparent phenomenal concepts. I'm going to be working under that assumption. Still, I'm going to say a lot of things as to what it really means and why some people might be motivated to believe that, right? But so the easier version, the simplified versions I'm going to be looking at are those two claims here. At least some structural phenomenal concepts are transparent concepts, and there can be multiple phenomenal ways of grasping the essence of some properties. So if I establish one, then I'm going to consider two, right? So here are some steps for the talk. I'm going to present a view of experiences and of phenomenal concepts, a view I will operate with for this talk. Then I'm going to define structural phenomenal concepts in a more thorough manner. I'm going to argue for claims 1 and 2. And I'm going to articulate a conception of what a phenomenal structure is. And finally, I'm going to try to draw some consequences from those considerations about structural phenomenal knowledge. Okay. So here is a view of experiences and conscious subjects. It's a view that starts from a relation between experiences and subjects. This view is that experiences are events constituted by subjects having properties at times. It's a view that has been defended by Henry Taylor and also famously Martin and Ida Remelin. And so what are those properties? Those properties are, in Martin's terminology, experiential properties. So an experiential property is a property that satisfies this definition. Property P is an experiential property, EP, if and only if, in virtue of what it is to have that property. Whenever P is instantiated, there is a subject S, such that there is something it is like for S to have P in that instantiation. It's quite a mouthful, so I'm going to use a simplified version of this here. An experiential property is a property is experiential, sorry, if and only if there is something it's like to have it for the one who has it. Right. So amongst all the properties in the world, there are those properties that there is something it's like to have, and those are experiential properties. Examples of experiential properties: hearing the rumble of the motorcycle, being angry, thinking about lunch, feeling pain, etc. Those are all properties that conscious subjects that you can instantiate, that maybe you have instantiated. Okay, here's the view of phenomenal concepts I'm going to be operating with. It's a view that conceives of concepts as concepts that we use to attribute experiential properties to oneself and to other conscious subjects. So this is a view that has been developed by Martine. And for some of those definitions, we worked together in the context of that paper. So here's the definition of phenomenal concepts that we can use on that view. Phenomenal concepts in the broad sense. A concept C is a phenomenal concept in the broad sense, if and only if there is an experiential property such that to attribute that experiential property via that concept involves thinking of that experiential property as being, experiential, sorry, that should be P instead of EP, I guess. That is, as being such that there is something it is like to have it. But if you attribute a property by, and you attribute it, in your attribution you think of it as being experiential, then you're using a phenomenal concept according to that definition. So I'm not going to go into the detail of that quote by Charles Siebert there, but I guess this is a view of phenomenal concept that is controversial, of course. I mean, maybe some people are tempted to wonder why we should be able to attribute those properties to other subjects. I mean, there are many very interesting considerations in that direction that Siebert is alluding to there. One is that you don't really have master or possess mental or psychological predicates unless you can also accurately apply them to other subjects. What if, what you attribute with phenomenal concepts are properties? If phenomenal concepts are really concepts of properties, then there may be also considerations coming from Evans' generality constraint that speak in favor of the idea that you should also be able to apply that concept to attribute properties to other subjects rather than only yourself. We can discuss this if you want. I'm not going to go into those details right now. What is interesting for my purposes here is an understanding of what transparent phenomenal concepts are. We've seen some definitions today already. But here is what I'm going to use. So, transparent phenomenal concept. The concept C is a transparent phenomenal concept if and only if there is an experiential property EP, such that to attribute EP via C to a subject S is to think of S having EP in terms of the specific way it is like for S to have that experiential property. Here again, for the sake of a clear exposition of ideas, this is a simplified definition. Very happy to hear objections on it. We can discuss them later. I've got more thorough versions up my sleeve.
Which bit of that makes it more than just any phenomenal concept? I mean, where's the transparent bit in there?
Yeah, I'm getting to that, yeah. So earlier I had this definition of a broad phenomenal concept in the broad sense. When you have a phenomenal concept in the broad sense, or any other type of phenomenal concept, you don't really have in mind the specific way it is like to have that experiential property when you attribute it. Right? Your concept, your phenomenal concept, is only going to be transparent when you have that specific way it is like to have the experiential property in mind as you attribute that property to a subject. That's not going to be enough, of course. I mean, what you're going to also need is that the property that you attribute to this subject is what is called here pure experiential property. So an experiential property is a pure experiential property if and only if there is some specific way it is like to have that experiential property, and having that property consists in that specific way it is like to have it. I mean, I guess, of course, physicalists might want to deny that there are such properties, right? Because that, in effect, is saying that it's a property that consists in what it is like to have it, right? We can also discuss that later, but for my purpose here, this is what I'm going to run with. So, phenomenal dual carving restated with those definitions. There's one more bit of business that I need to get done, is the definition of a structural phenomenal concept. So we had before seen this example of Paola's concept of seeing pure blue, right? And here I want to say that the concept sees a structural phenomenal concept if and only if there is an experiential property EP, such that to attribute EP via C to a subject S is to think of S having that property in terms of that property's position in a wider phenomenal structure. And the claim is that this is what Paola is doing, right, with her structural phenomenal concept of seeing pure blue. She can use that concept to attribute the experiential property of seeing pure blue, and when she does that, she thinks of the subject seeing pure blue in terms of the position of the experiential property seeing pure blue in a wider phenomenal structure. Okay, I'm going to give more substance to the notion of phenomenal structure just in a minute. But for now, I want to look at those two claims I had singled out before. And I want to evaluate them and clarify them more by considering objections. So objection one. All right, this is the definition of transparent phenomenal concept I had. Here is claim one. This is Paola's structural phenomenal concept. And the objection is that structural phenomenal concepts such as Paola's, they are just not specific enough to be transparent. They're not going to be concepts that when you have formed them, you can have in mind the specific way it's like to have a given experiential property. But given that framework and that view of phenomenal concepts and transparent phenomenal concepts, you need to have in mind the specific way it's like to have an experiential property. So that's going to be a problem for the claim that those structural concepts are transparent. Okay. So in a more thorough version, the objection is that Paola's structural phenomenal concept is not specific enough to be transparent because only maximally specific phenomenal concepts are transparent. Okay. So here's Paul Acquaintance phenomenal concept that I had from earlier in my example. And the idea is that it's quite straightforward to see that Paul's acquaintance concept is maximally specified, right? Because it's maximally specific, sorry. Maximally specific phenomenal concepts are concepts that are such that no aspect of the specific way it is like to have an experiential property can be further specified without that concept attributing a different experiential property than the one it in fact attributes. So when you have a phenomenal concept that is maximally specific, then you have in mind the specific way it's like to have an experiential property, the specific way it's like to have an experience, and there is no aspect of that specific way it is like that can be further specified without that concept, in fact, attributing a different experience, a different experiential property. So that's to say that phenomenal concepts can be more or less specific. Maybe there is even a maximally unspecific, there are maximally unspecific phenomenal concepts, but not really at the center of interest for this here. But we shouldn't confuse the issue of a phenomenal concept being maximally specific and the issue of an experiential property being maximally determinate. So an experiential property is maximally determinate. This is what we have here. Even only if it is impossible to find a subcase of that experiential property by further specifying an aspect of what it is like to have it. It sounds an awful lot like the definition of maximally specific phenomenal concepts, but it's very important to grasp, to understand the difference. Because, as I'm going to suggest, many of our maximally specific phenomenal concepts, they don't attribute, in fact, experiential property that are maximally specific. You can think, as I have here on the bottom left, you can think of the maximally specific phenomenal concept, of the maximally determinate experiential property that attributes your entire conscious episode right now. I mean, there is such a property, there is such a concept. I think we don't have probably the conceptual capacity to form such a concept. It's so specific, and my overall conscious episode right now is so complex that probably we cannot form such a concept. And why do I mention this? Because I think sometimes when talking about phenomenal concepts, there is this idea that some people have that phenomenal concept is a bit strange because anyways, I mean, we cannot really capture what it's like to have an experience. It's so complex and so detailed that we don't really have concept of experiences. And what this points towards is that, in fact, our phenomenal concepts are really concepts of phenomenal commonalities between different experiential states we are in. They are not concepts of exactly the experiential state in all its minor details that I'm having right now. Okay, so back to the objection and what we can extract from this. So actually most of our maximally specific phenomenal concepts, as I was saying, they attribute experiential properties that are not maximally determinate. They are concepts of phenomenal commonalities between experiential properties. In fact, we always, of course, instantiate a determinable experiential property by instantiating a maximally determinate experiential property. Right? It's not as if we can instantiate experiential properties that are not completely determinate. Right? For instance, a subject instantiates the experiential property of seeing pure blue by instantiating an experiential property that is more determinate than just that. It's the experiential property of seeing pure blue with a given saturation, for instance, right? So, Paola's structural concept of seeing pure blue is maximally specific, but it does not, of course, capture the maximally determinate experiential property that Paul instantiates when he sees pure blue, right? But Paola still, I mean, that's not required by having a maximally determinate phenomenal concept of seeing pure blue. And Paola achieves a maximally specific conceptualization of seeing pure blue by combining the phenomenal concepts of seeing a unique hue, seeing greenish blue, and seeing, I have 2 times greenish blue, but it should be reddish blue, as you've guessed. So in other words, I mean, seeing pure blue is the hue that is singled out by considering like a continuous scale of hues ranging from violet on one end and turquoise on the other end, and then identifying the hue that is perfectly in the middle, the hue that has no trace of red and no trace of blue. And Paola's structural concept of pure blue specifically picks out experiencing pure blue, not because of conceptual facts, the way we think about those color experiences, but because of phenomenological facts. I mean, it's a phenomenological fact that experiencing pure blue is the experiential property that is picked out by this structural phenomenal concept. Okay, now, even if you're convinced that this structural phenomenal concept is specific enough, you might think, well, this is not the nasty bit of business here, because there is a much more serious obstacle for the suggestion that there can be some sort of phenomenal dual carving, right? And namely, one that has to do with this notion of comparative transparency we've been discussing already. So objection 2. Objection to the second claim, there can be multiple phenomenal ways of grasping the essence of some property. So the objection says, Paola's structural phenomenal concept is not conceptually distinct from Paul's acquaintance phenomenal concept. Recall Philip's definition. It requires that for at least one property, there are two conceptually distinct transparent concepts of K. So how should we understand conceptually distinct? That's going to matter a whole lot. So one way to do it would be in terms of the possession conditions of those concepts. So it seems that Paul can possess the maximally specific phenomenal concept of seeing pure blue that he has formed on the basis of seeing pure blue without possessing the structural phenomenal concept, right? I mean, that seems easy enough. For instance, if Paul does not possess the phenomenal concept of seeing a unique U, right? He has no idea about unique U's as opposed to binary U's, but still he has seen pure blue. He might not even know that this is a unique U, but he has formed, on the basis of being acquainted with that experiential property, a maximally specific phenomenal concept of it. Still usual case that we have in the literature. Other direction. Can Paola possess the structural phenomenal concept of seeing pure blue without possessing the usual concept of seeing pure blue? Right. That seems a bit more difficult. I want to say yes, because of two considerations. One, well, she has never seen pure blue. That seems to point in the direction that she doesn't have that phenomenal concept that Paul has. Another consideration relies on imaginative capacities. So the capacity to imagine having an experiential property in terms of what it is like to have that experiential property is part of the possession conditions of a normal phenomenal concept, an acquaintance phenomenal concept. Usually when you have it, you're able to imagine what it's like to have the experiential property it is a concept of. But that capacity is not part of the possession condition of the structural phenomenal concept. Sorry. I mean, here the argument is a bit more complex than what I'm going to make out right now, but we can discuss it. This is one claim that we make actually in that paper on phenomenal concept and imagination with Martinet. I think usually what we want to say is that if someone has the structural phenomenal concept that Paola has formed, then one should be in a position to imagine what it is like to see pure blue. But we can imagine circumstances in which that's not the case, right? And it doesn't seem that just not having that capacity means that you don't have the concept. On the other hand, I mean, if you really have no capacity to imagine the specific way it's like to see pure blue, it's hard to see in what sense you would have the acquaintance phenomenal concept of seeing pure blue. This is not to say that there are no imaginative capacities that come with having the structural phenomenal concept. I mean, surely you should be able to imagine what it's like to see greenish blue and to see reddish blue. And you should be able to imagine seeing a unique hue and to imagine seeing a binary hue, right? And the idea is that on the basis of those conceptual capacities and phenomenal concepts that you have, you can build the acquaintance phenomenal concept, but you might not do it and not be able to do it because, I don't know, some failure of your imaginative capacities, for instance, or you're just bad at putting together those different conceptual bits. So this would be another reason to believe that the implication in the other direction, that having the structural concept does not imply having the acquaintance phenomenal concept, right? So this was the objection, a response to the objection in terms of possession condition. But as you suspect, there is something more pressing and maybe more difficult to answer there. It's not just that when we say that those two concepts in dual carving are distinct, that one can process one without processing the other, but we want to say that they are conceptually distinct. And they are cognitively independent. So here is again the principle of cognitive independence that Martinet Nida-Remelin has in her paper Grasping Phenomenal Properties. She writes, a person who grasps one and the same property via different concepts can in principle find out, without further empirical investigation, that the two concepts are necessarily coextensive. Right? Can compare this with Paul's transparency principle. I mean, it seems Martinet's principle is formulated only in terms of transparent concept, because concept that allow one to grasp a property. So in that sense, it's a bit weaker, maybe. I'm not going to go into that. But what I'm interested in discussing is this. How can a thinker that has both concepts, the structural concept, the structural phenomenal concept, and the usual acquaintance phenomenal concept, how can one find out, right, that there are concepts of one and the same experiential property? Given dual carving, I mean, it should, for this to be real dual carving, you know, it should not be able, we should not be able to do this a priori. Right? And here's what Brentano apparently believed on this. Here again, I'm following Soldati. But this looks like bad news for dual carving. Because he was actually sorry, this sounds like good news, on the contrary. Bad news for people who are against dual carving, because Brentano had the view that, well, it's not a priori, because finding out that those two concepts are concepts of one and the same thing requires inner perception, in other terms, introspection. But I guess Brentano's view is quite complex. Cannot really go into all the details here. But here's what Soldati writes on that point. Brentano's phenomenological analysis starts from the assumption that there is complexity in the phenomena associated with the concepts, not just the concepts themselves. Right? Complexity in their appearances. Phenomenological analysis is not just a decomposition of complex concepts, and this is the reason why it requires more than mere understanding. It is not enough to grasp the concepts. One further needs to be acquainted with the associated phenomena. Phenomenological analysis, contrary to the empiricist analysis of concept, is not a priori. It requires inner perception. So it's going to be with the help of inner perception that we're going to be able to find out that, our phenomenal concept of hearing a tone actually attributes the same experience than this concept in terms of strength, pitch, and timbre. It's going to be by attending quite closely to what it is like to hear a tone that we can find that out. And it's not just conceptual analysis in the usual sense of the term, where if we just understand the concept and we are able to decompose it in different bits and see that those different bits are contained in the concept. His view is a bit hard to follow because he uses analytic and empirical in maybe different ways than we are used to today. I think Brentano had the view that this is analytic still, right? But it's empirical. So it's a bit strange. I think the view that we should go for is the following. To find this out, a thinker, sorry for the typo, must engage in phenomenological reflection. So here's what I have in mind. In order to find out that the structural concept and the acquaintance concept serve to attribute the same experiential property, then you need to have in mind both conceptualizations of what it is like to see pure blue and to reflect phenomenologically on whether both coincide. Interestingly, I don't think that there is a way to do this that does not rely on imagination. This is also a point we make in that paper with Martine. So it turns out that imagining what it is like to have a given experiential property, is quite central in phenomenological reflection. Now, is it a priori? Well, things are a bit more complex than they might initially seem. The possession of acquaintance and structural phenomenal concept does come with the imaginative abilities that are relevant to engaging in phenomenological reflection about them. Even though having the structural concept doesn't, give you the require that you have the ability to imagine what it's like to see pure blue, for instance. You still have, as I said, if you have that structural concept, it does come with the ability to imagine seeing a unique hue as opposed to a binary hue, or seeing reddish blue as opposed to greenish blue, etc. So it seems that once you have those two concepts, you have all the conceptual material and the imaginative abilities that you need in order to form the other concept. You might fail to do so, but it doesn't seem that you need to gather more empirical information, for instance. So that would be a way of fending off and of not having to commit to dual carving entirely, right? Okay, for the time that remains, I want to say something about phenomenal structures, because structural phenomenal concepts, they require a certain understanding of phenomenal structures, and I think that's something very interesting for consciousness, our understanding of consciousness in general. So a phenomenal structure is a net, that view is a net of relations obtaining between experiential properties, that is, between the way it's like to have them. And I think that those relations come in different types. And we can compare many examples and do a lot of phenomenological reflection. We don't have a lot of time to do it right now, but consider those different cases. The case of hearing an interval. So you can hear a tone and hear another tone, and you can hear them together, like when you hear a third, and you also hear, by hearing both simultaneously, you hear like the interval that is composed of both. Here it really seems that it's a case of, you know, the experience itself, or the experiential property itself, or the hearing itself being composed of different bits that you can bring together. So you can experience, you can hear this tone on its own, you can hear that tone on its own, you can hear them together. It really seems to be a case where composition, in the way Brentano was talking about it, is happening. It doesn't seem to be quite the same when you think about experiencing orange, where surely you can, you know, focus your introspective attention on the yellowish aspect of how it's like to experience it, and you can focus your introspective attention on the reddish aspect of what it's like to experience it. It's not quite that there are components in the same sense in which hearing a tone is a component of hearing an interval. I don't think that seeing orange is just seeing red and yellow superimposed on each other. It's also not so clear that, you know, being presented with the pure you is an aspect of the experience that we can introspectively focus on our attention on, in the way we can focus our introspective attention on the yellowish and the reddish aspect. So it seems to be the case that we need different notions. We need to develop maybe a terminology here to make sense of those differences in the different structural relations that there are between experiential properties. Still, I think we should be interested in what I call here structural phenomenal knowledge. So this is knowledge about phenomenal structure, that is, about the relations that are obtaining between experiential properties. Here is another piece, I'm going to conclude with this, another piece of phenomenological reflection that we can read in terms of trying to achieve structural phenomenal knowledge. It's an argument that Charles Sievert gives against innocence. He writes, first order case, consider the change in how a stable figure looks to you as you shift attention while it appears unchanged. This allows you to distinguish what is visually sensed from how it is objectually sensed. This might sound a bit obscure, but it's consider the case in which, you know, you have a chair in the center of the room and you look at it while walking around it. You can then distinguish what is visually sensed from how it is sensed, because your experience keeps changing, but in a certain sense, what you're saying remains the same. And then Sievert goes on and says, okay, second order case, this would be the introspective case, because he's arguing against this inner sense view of introspection. Now repeat the same sort of operation on the visual appearance. Without changing the way the figure looks to you, shift your attention with respect to this constant, stable appearance, so as to alter how that appearance is sensed by you. In the first order case, the operation seems, again, easy enough. But in the second order case, I am drawn up short. How do I even try to follow these instructions? How could I vary the way the visual appearance is experienced or sensed by me without changing the figure's visual appearance to me? If I cannot do this, then I just can't find, in first-person reflection, an objectual higher-order sensing of sensing. I mean, his language is sometimes a bit difficult to follow, but what he's really after here is denying that there are second-order appearances. So if you consider how a chair appears to you, as you walk around it, it keeps changing, in a sense, the way it appears to you, because you might see, different parts of it. In other sense, you're still under the impression of seeing the same chair, so there is some change constancy. So now if you consider the way the chair appears to you itself, can you also, can this appearance itself appear in different ways? Right? That's what he's asking. He says, no, we seem not to be able to even imagine what it would be like. It's not the way he says it, but we cannot try to follow this instruction and make this happen. Right? I think this would be a piece of phenomenological reflection that is about phenomenal structure in quite a different way from the other ones we've seen so far. It's really about the relative position of two experiential properties. One would be the maximally determinable experiential properties of perceiving an object. Right? What is really essential to perception? In Sievert's view, it's some sense of change constancy. The other experiential property is introspective awareness. And then we are trying to see what is the relation between those two experiences, between those two experiential properties. And we are trying to see whether, are there two subcases of one common genus or not? One common genus or not? And I guess Sievert is saying no. So their relative position in phenomenal structure is not that, simple case introspection is just a subcase of perceiving. That's not what's going on, right? So I'm going to leave you with that and a last remark about structural phenomenal knowledge. It seems that knowledge about phenomenal structure, or structural phenomenal knowledge, is distinct from the phenomenal knowledge that we usually focus on in debates about physicalism. For instance, knowing what it is like to see red. Right? But it also seems that structural phenomenal knowledge is difficult to access, or maybe even inaccessible, as I have put it here, in the objective or physicalist perspective. So how are we supposed to go about finding out what those relations are between experiential properties if we are a physicalist? It seems really to find out about these relations, what we need is to do first-person phenomenological reflection, right? It's not so clear how we can find out, for instance, that there are no second-order appearances by, studying brains and visual apparatus, and find out that, in fact, there are no second-order appearances, because it seems the notion itself of an appearance is rooted in inner perception, as Brentano would say, in introspection. I mean, we need to be able to be subjects that engage in phenomenological reflection in order to have that notion and to understand whether the claim that there could be a second-order appearance makes sense or not. And I think this all points to the idea that perhaps we should expand our conception of phenomenal knowledge beyond, mere atomic qualities, like what we sometimes refer to with the expression of qualia. I mean, if that's right, much of the structure of consciousness is also very difficult to access in a third-person, objective perspective. That's all from me. Thank you.